Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I like your new jacket. And welcome everybody. I'm always pleased to be here in Thailand, and this is my second visit to Payao, and very much looking forward to coming back again. Anyway. So what I want to do is to talk on the same theme that Professor Chen addressed yesterday, which is how to publish your research. And what I'll do is probably go into rather more specific details about preparing a paper. But I want to start really, first start by asking a question. Can you first raise your hand if you've already had a paper published? Yes, okay, come on. Yeah. Okay, so we've got, keep your hands up, please. Hands up, yeah, if you've had a paper published. So there's quite a lot who haven't. Okay, and if you've had more than one paper published, keep your hand up. Great, okay. If you've had more than 5 papers published, keep your hand up. Okay, so you can leave actually. You don't really need to have any help from me. But I want to remind you what the point of publication is really. To have a good paper, you need good results. And those good results need to be clear and they need to be meaningful. But you can't get good results unless you have a good project. So a good project needs to be well designed. It needs to be carefully thought through. But to design a good project, you need a good idea. So remember that writing a research paper actually starts 3 or 4 years beforehand when you're designing the project from your hopefully good idea. And unless you have that good idea, unless you have that good project, you can't have a good paper. And I've several times been asked by people to say, how can we make this a good paper? But we can't make a good paper without having a well-designed project. And often you may have a good idea, but sometimes the problem is that the project is not well designed. So I want to get you to think a bit about that in the next hour. Okay, so what I'll be talking about is really starting by understanding a bit about how biomedical research is done. I want to talk a bit about some problems in research that many of you will meet. And then I'll talk in more detail about how to publish your research, preparing the manuscript. It's essentially elaborating on what Professor Chen said yesterday, and also discuss how to write to the editor and how to respond to the reviewer's comments in more detail. So, how do we do biomedical research? We start by identifying a problem. So that's your good idea, hopefully. Or finding the problem, applying your idea to that problem. So in doing so, you propose a hypothesis. And that hypothesis needs to be tested, and you test it by designing a study and then doing the work. And of course, it's that work that's the major part of the project. You're collecting samples, you're doing the measurements and so on. Then, of course, you have to analyze the data, and you have to do that correctly. There are many studies that fall down because the data has not been analyzed in an appropriate way. And then, of course, you write the paper, you publish the paper. But of course, like all research, you go on then to the next problem, because whatever you do, the more research you do, the more questions rise that you need to answer. Okay, so we want to identify the problem. So this is going to be an example from my own research. One of the, actually, as you've heard, I've published a lot of papers, but not many of them are very good. This one we were very lucky with, so I like to use it as an example because it's a good study, I think. I've been interested in schizophrenia and the treatment of schizophrenia for many years. And one big problem is that people with schizophrenia often get very fat when they're treated with the drugs. And there, I've got an example for you. This was from a study we did showing that at 3 months, the BMI increases by 10% on average if these patients are starting on a couple of these drugs, risperidone or olanzapine. At 9 months, the BMI on average for somebody on olanzapine goes up by 20%. So that's a lot. That's a big difference. But what we noticed, and what has been very apparent, is that some people on the same drugs don't get fat and some people get very, very fat. And here's an example. In this study, one person, although they were taking the drug, they didn't put on any weight. Another person put on 74%. So imagine what that is, especially for a young woman, very disturbed from her psychotic experiences, and she finds that the treatment which is making her better is actually making her very, very fat. So of course, that is going to be a major problem for several reasons. So we want to understand why some people put on a lot of weight and some people don't. And the reason it's a big problem is seen here, that on the left, we have the physical effects. We have metabolic syndrome, which is really just a name for increased obesity, insulin resistance, and hyperlipidemia, which leads to type 2 diabetes, increases risk of type 2 diabetes, and increases risk of heart disease. But that's the physical aspect. The psychological aspect, of course, is that people who are getting fat think that drugs are making them fat. They don't want to be fat, so they stop taking drugs. And that, of course, leads to increased risk of relapse and reemergence of symptoms. So let's think, how do we address this problem? We have to understand the background, and understanding the background means thinking about what it is that controls weight gain and how the drugs interact with that. And we know that there are receptors in the brain which are blocked by some of the antipsychotic drugs, and those include a receptor called the 5-HT2C receptor. So we thought that differences between people in weight, in terms of their weight or weight gain following drug treatment, might also be due to differences in their genes. So we put these two facts together, and what we see is that we can develop a hypothesis. We can develop a hypothesis that says genetic variability in a receptor that controls weight and is interacted with by some of the antipsychotic drugs, that might be associated with whether or not a patient gets increases in weight. And so we designed a study, and designing that study, we thought the best way to do this is to get patients who have not started on antipsychotic drug treatment just as they've been diagnosed, and follow the course of their body weight as they start on drugs. So we measured the changes in weight over 10 weeks of these first episode patients with schizophrenia. And we took samples of their DNA and measured the differences, the genetic differences between individuals in terms of one gene, which is the gene for that 5-HT2C receptor, which is important in controlling food intake. So that was the study design. And I was able to do this because I was collaborating with a group in China who had access to fairly large numbers of patients with who were diagnosed with schizophrenia for the first time. And so we did the study and we analyzed the results. And what we found was that genetic differences in one gene, in one variant of the 5-HT2C gene, this is a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP as it's called. A C changes to G in some people. And here we have the results that people with a C allele increase in body weight substantially, change in BMI of over 1 after 10 weeks treatment. But if you have a T allele, you show very little weight gain. So very happy with that result, and we eventually published it. And that was not an easy publication. I had to argue with the editor about whether or not it was an interesting and important paper. But we managed to convince the editor that it was important, and after review, it was accepted for publication in the Lancet. So we were very pleased with that. And that really illustrates to you, I think, how we can develop address a simple medical problem, simple biomedical problem, that many of you, I'm sure, can think of simple biomedical problems that we don't really understand the answer for. And having an idea and being able to apply it eventually gives us a good publication. I want to give you another example which is a very, very simple study. It required very little work and also came from a collaboration with some people in China who were, in fact, just starting on doing research themselves. And it was to look at Parkinson's disease. So the background to this is that Parkinson's disease, we don't really know everything that causes it. We know that there are genetic risks, but we also know that there is environmental risk, particularly exposure to pesticides. And we see that in farmers in Thailand and in China, that there is thought to be an association between exposure to pesticides and getting Parkinson's disease. We also think that one of the mechanisms is through oxidative free radical damage. So we also know, as I've said, agricultural work, so being a farmer, is associated with exposure to pesticides. We also know that there is a circulating antioxidant in the body, often not really considered as very important, and that is uric acid. Uric acid causes gout when there's too much of it. But when there's too little of it, you don't have enough antioxidant prevention. So we developed a hypothesis, or developed two hypotheses, on the basis of the fact that we could, with my colleagues in a hospital in southern China, we could look at patient records and identify a hypothesis that was testable in the sample that we had, or the facilities we had. There were two hypotheses. One was that hospital admissions for Parkinson's disease would be relatively greater in agricultural workers, and the other hypothesis was hospital admissions for Parkinson's disease would have lower levels of uric acid. Okay, those were our two hypotheses, and all we had to do is go through patient records to look at biochemical data from the lab and details of diagnosis of people coming into a big general hospital in southern China. And this is something that could be done very easily also in Thailand, I think. And then we found that actually our hypotheses were correct. And in doing that, we were able to publish a fairly simple paper that essentially showed that both agricultural work and low levels of uric acid were risk factors for Parkinson's disease. So I use this as an illustration really of very simple biomedical research that anybody, by making contact with doctors in a hospital, can test a hypothesis and addressing an important problem in a very simple way. And you too can do that. You can choose your favorite problem, your favorite disease, perhaps, and think of ways in which you can study those patients in a simple way by collaborating with clinical staff, for example. So I want to talk a bit now about some of the problems in biomedical research which may limit our ability to do the work and eventually get publications. One is that objectivity is very important. It's very easy to be biased when you assess data. We know what the outcome might be, so we do our very best to ensure that the outcome is what we expect. And that's, of course, why controls and blinding are so very, very important. Another point is that your hypothesis might be wrong, and you need to accept that. And think that it's more important that you do the work properly, that your results are correct, than your ideas are correct. You can have a good idea, it might be wrong, but that's what the scientific method is about. You propose a hypothesis, and hopefully you can get evidence which supports your hypothesis. But sometimes, in fact, often, you may find that that evidence does not support your hypothesis. And so, if the result is unexpected, you must remember that it's the wrong result only if you haven't designed your project properly. If you design a project well, then your results will be correct. And even if those results are telling you that your hypothesis is wrong. So it's better that your results are correct than your ideas are correct. One other point I think we should make, which is very obvious, is that we should talk to our colleagues and exchange ideas. Now, I noticed that in many university departments, in many groups, there may be people working on the same project, but they don't always talk to one another. You know, they may have the same interests. So maybe I should ask a question now. How many people here are interested? We know that Thailand has got some new regulations regarding the use of cannabis. How many people here are interested in cannabis use in Thailand and its medical uses? Can you put up your hand if you have an interest in that? So, we got 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so we've got here somebody at the back from Payao University, yes, and several people from Naresuan University. Maybe you should be talking to one another and discussing how best to develop your research, and perhaps you can learn from one another. That's just one example, but it would be nice to know that those of you who are studying cannabinoids might be talking to one another, exchanging ideas. When you go for dinner in the evening, think about how you can chat to your friends about research and what your different approaches are. We know that Sutisa is supervising several of you, but she can't be an expert. It's you who are the experts because you're doing the work. You're reading all the papers. Sutisa can't read all the papers that all of you have to read. So need to develop your expertise, but not alone. You have to do it by talking to other people. And that's true for all sorts of disorders. You know, there'll be people here working on diabetes or on heart disease, very common topics in many universities. You need to be talking to one another about your projects. Okay, so and one other thing is that by talking to other people, you avoid making mistakes. And I've noticed in my many years of being a scientist, being a researcher, that most of the problems associated with research have been through people not talking to one another, not understanding what should be done. So it's always valuable to talk to our colleagues and exchange ideas. And if you don't understand something, ask about it. Another thing to think about is that negative results are important. So I've said already, it's better that your results are correct than your ideas are correct. So if your results are giving you negative data, that's still important. And I know it's difficult to get it published, but more and more journals now are accepting negative results from well-designed studies. So that's what's important. You can get negative results published if you have well-designed projects. And as I've said already, really, ideas and results are actually more important than methods. And when you're developing your career, think about, you know, often you think, oh, I want to be an expert in what I'm doing. But really your methodology, the things you do in the lab, are a means to an end, that you're trying to apply methods to biomedical problems. I've come across several students who are really keen on developing methodologies, but often lose sight of why they're doing that. Okay. Right, so that's really some background. And really, I've presented that to you to make you think about how you can best develop a research project, because a good research project will result in a good paper. A bad project can never give you a good paper. So how do you select the right journal? And this was a question that was asked yesterday. And I just want to elaborate on that a bit by asking really the question, what is the right journal? What is right for you? Is it the readership? So, you know, some journals are published by scientific societies who may get that journal, members who may get that journal for free. But maybe one way of targeting the audience for your paper. Or is it a very general study that's going to be of interest to many people outside your own speciality? So that, you know, do you want a general paper, as we did with the Lancet paper, or a specialist journal, as we did with the Parkinson's disease study? Do you go for high impact factor? Well, I know that high impact factor is important for many Asian universities. And although in Europe, I think we're trying to get away from that idea, there is still this underlying belief that the highest impact factor journal is the best journal to get into. That's not always the case. Impact factors can be manipulated by editors who accept a lot of review articles, for example. So review articles are going to be more likely to be cited, so that brings the impact factor up. So don't always think that the highest impact factor is the best journal for you. One way to identify a journal is whether it has previously published papers that are related to yours. And that's very easy to determine if you know the literature behind your study. Does the journal publish quickly, or does it take ages and ages to get something published? And I think that's big. Can be quite important, especially for final year PhD students who want to get something out fairly quickly so that they can graduate. You also need to think about the style and format of the paper. That I like to write fairly short papers, not great long complex ones. And some journals prefer big papers that have many components in them and don't take short communications. And some is the reverse. Some journals will prefer shorter, simpler studies. I've said here sympathetic to Asian manuscripts. I think maybe that's less important nowadays, that journals are being fairly unbiased in their presumption that in Asia, the quality of research may not be as good as we know it is. So hopefully that's going to be less of a problem. But I know that there have been instances in the past of particularly American journals being biased against developing countries. And this is something that was discussed yesterday, is the idea of these predatory journals. You just need to be aware that there are many new online journals which can take your money and they publish without proper peer review. There was somebody who I heard of who had got a computer to generate a lot of words in sentences that made absolutely no sense at all and sent it off to one of these journals and got that published. So, you know, they pretend sometimes to undertake peer review, but in fact, that's often not done properly. And they want your money, so they have it published, and it's only published online. It's not easily accessible. You can't find it by searching PubMed, because PubMed don't list these predatory journals. So just be aware of that. And they often, you know, they'll send you emails saying, we have a special offer, only $50. You can get published within 3 weeks. Ignore it, please. I said, I could do that. I could set up a website and take your money. But as Professor Chen said yesterday, it's not good for your research. It's not good for your reputation. So how do we write the paper? We've chosen the journal. How do we write the paper? You need to be aware of other related papers. You need to have a good understanding of the background. Always be thinking about how your work relates to other work in the field, how it improves on other studies. If it doesn't improve on other studies, you have to ask yourself why you are doing it. So, and use those other papers for ideas of how you prepare your paper. Another point is that scientists often forget this. You should be writing not for yourself, but for the reader. You've got to make it interesting for the reader. You decide what your main message is, you focus on that, and always think about, what is somebody going to think about what I've been writing? And the best way to do that is to give a copy of your paper to your colleagues and ask them to be critical. Decide what your main message is and focus on that, as I've said. That's very important. Otherwise, we can get lost in what you're trying to tell your audience. Remember your colleagues. Remember that everybody who is listed as an author should have contributed to that paper in some way, and they are also responsible for that paper. So ask your co-authors, even if there's somebody very important, like the dean, who has very little time, but is an author on your paper, you must ask them for advice and comments and suggestions, and they've got to approve your paper. Read and follow the journal instructions. It's not an obvious thing to say, but often people don't. And in fact, I know that I don't always check the website of the journal to make sure I'm preparing the paper in the way that the journal wants. Be tidy. It's very annoying for a reviewer to receive a paper that's a bit of a mess, where tables are split across 2 pages. That's very frustrating. So be tidy. You learn how to use the page break in Word. Make sure you can use Word properly. Tables and figures are often best in separate files or at the end of the text file. If they're in the text, yeah, as I've said, use page breaks to stop them being divided across 2 pages. It's very frustrating for a reader to come across that. Define abbreviations first time you use them, of course. Format your references in the style of the journal, and use the correct format for abstract and text headings. So obvious points, really. Look at the layout and format of published papers. I already said that published papers can help you with the background and with the content and layout. So use that layout and format and use other papers as a template, but don't copy and paste. And we know that there's software to detect that, fortunately. After that first paper that I mentioned, the Lancet paper was published, I was sent a paper to review, which I thought was quite good. It has a very similar approach to ours. And then I started reading the methods. And in the methods, it was word for word how I had described the patients. So what I did was say, write back to the editor, say, this has been copied from our paper. We cannot trust the authors. This paper must be rejected immediately. So that's very bad for that person's reputation. So the editor will know although the reviewer didn't know who it is, the editor knows who it is. And they're not going to accept a paper from them very readily in the future. So be very careful about copying and pasting. Just a few language errors. These are errors that not only are seen in Asian students, but also in English students. Some of my PhD students who you would think would have a very good understanding of English. They're intellectually the top students, but they still mix up affect and effect. They often forget the data is plural, although I think nowadays people are beginning to be more lax about that. But a problem with Asian manuscripts is often you use plurals that we never use. Never informations, never evidences, never researches. Think about the tense, and this is difficult. It can be difficult for experienced English speakers too. But one way is to ask yourself, is it true now? So here we see Wang found. That's something he did the study in the past. So he found that cognition is impaired because it's true now. So the past tense describes what was done, the present tense where the finding is generally true. And even that is not a hard and fast rule. There is some flexibility, I think. So then think about the title. And we've already had Professor Chen telling us how there are different types of title. Here I've divided it up in a very similar way, actually. But I think there are three main types of title, and we've got three titles here, all from Thai studies. There's a description of the study. That is really a way of describing your hypothesis. It doesn't tell you the result, but it describes the hypothesis. What is the effect of methamphetamine exposure on calcium binding proteins? There is a research question, which is perhaps rarer, but can be useful if the results are not always as clear as you might want them to be, or the conclusion isn't absolutely clear. So here we've got the question whether elevated receptor gene expression relates to cognitive deficits. And the other way of having a title is to summarize the results. In other words, you include the results there. So here we've got brain-derived neurotrophic factor, genetic polymorphism is associated with vulnerability to meth dependence. So there we've got the results very clear in the title. And that's probably the most attractive of these titles because it's telling us what the answer is. Okay. Now we go on to write the introduction. You write a brief summary of the background to your work. And we heard yesterday how the format of a scientific paper is like an hourglass. General to specific, through specific methodology, specific results, and then generalizing those results in a discussion. So anyway, right. So write a brief summary of the background. So you're talking about what the general background, the general context of your work is. It has to be enough to explain why your study is important and worth doing. But you remember you'll need to review other work in the discussion. So I don't think the introduction needs to be a comprehensive review of the field. It just needs to provide enough information to justify your study. So as I've said, go from general to specific. Start with a general statement of the context of the work and end with the particular focus of that work, hopefully including a description of the hypothesis. Now, methods are easy, it's fairly straightforward. You probably start writing the methods two or 3 years before you publish the paper, because that's part of the research. So it's usually best to start writing methods and results section as you work on the project. Remember, for human samples, you have to have informed consent, ethical approvals, same ethical approval for animal studies. Experimental methods can be brief if they repeat other or refer to other published methods. Don't describe methods that don't have results included. So, often you may have a project where you do a lot of things, some work, some don't. You're reporting some of the things that work, but you've got to make sure that your methods and your results match up. And I've seen papers where they have a method, but there haven't been a result to go with it. So remember that. In the results section, assuming it's separate from the discussion, is really just telling us what you found. You don't interpret data in the results section. Unless it's a joint results and discussion section, you don't interpret or comment on them. Don't repeat data in the text that's also in a table. You don't need to do that. It's often useful, though, to report that data in another way. So maybe you've got a list of numbers for control and experimental group in a table. You can, when you describe them, don't use those numbers again or repeat those p-values, but you can perhaps describe the data in a slightly different way as a percentage change to make it easier for the reader to understand and interpret the data. Remember that usually sample size, ages, sex, weights, these sorts of things are results rather than in the methods. Now, statistics is always a problem. I've always found statistics a problem, and my students always have, maybe because I'm not teaching them well. But a few things you can remember about stats, and that is you have to be accurate in describing the data. So when you do a statistical test and group A is lower than group B, you can say it's significantly decreased, if that's what you mean. Sometimes things are different, but not significantly different. That doesn't mean that they are the same. You know, it may be that in this room, the women are slightly smaller than the men on average. That may, if we do a statistical test, that may not be statistically significant. That doesn't mean that men and women are the same height. So be accurate in how you describe your statistical findings. This just illustrates that on the left, you've got a very big difference, a p-value showing a highly significant difference. And you can describe that. The middle pair of columns is the only instance where you can say they are not different. They're the same because the mean values are the same. So mean values are not different, but that's the only example. On the right, we have two columns with a non-significant p-value. T is less, it's not, but it's not the same. It's just not significantly different. So just remember that when you're describing your data. So discussion. Start with a simple summary of the main findings. I'm saying this because this is what I think is the best. Discussions can be fairly flexible in how you write them, but you want to still engage the reader. You want to make the reader interested. So the best way, I think, is probably to summarize the main findings, but don't repeat what you've said in the results section already. Relate your findings to your hypothesis. So we were talking yesterday about this hourglass shape of the scientific paper. What I think is that the bottom of that hourglass, the general bit of the discussion, must relate back to the introduction. It's important to put it in context, and you do that by relating it back, either implicitly, just by describing how it's important in the context of the study that you've done, or you could even say, as we have suggested in the introduction, we have found that such and such has changed. So you can always relate back your findings to what you've to your approach in the introduction. Always discuss the limitations. If you don't think it has any limitations, then you're wrong. Every study, there is no study that is perfect. Every study is limited. If you don't write the limitations in the paper, then the reviewer will have more ammunition to shoot down your paper. So describe the limitations. There's always limitations of size. There's no study is so big that it's perfect. So if you're using, 6 animals or 12 animals, you can always say this study is limited by the size. And here I've given an example of how to write those limitations. So I said, this is a small study. Okay, so I acknowledge it's a small study, but I say is nevertheless is consistent with the results of other reports. So I'm saying, although it's a small study, our results are good because they're consistent with other people. Then I say further limitations reflect short-term cross-sectional nature of the study. That means I realize that we haven't studied the patients over a long period, but the results are still interesting. I've also said we employed very simple assessments, but because a reviewer might say, well, why didn't you look at these different areas of the brain rather than bigger areas, which is what we did? I can answer that before he asks the question by saying subdivision in what is a small cohort would further diminish sample sizes. So I don't want to subdivide the sample. And that really will address another possible criticism. And then, I say, nevertheless, these findings present interesting associations. So although there are limitations, I'm saying, the data is interesting and worth publishing. And I think you can use that. Always think about the limitations, but always try to answer a criticism of those limitations. So I suggest here to write the abstract after you've written the main paper, because then you know what you have to summarize. But maybe that's not always the best way to do it. If you're stuck, one way is to write an abstract just to give you an idea of the overall picture of your study. Might make it easier to get into writing the introduction, for example. But you need to write or rewrite that abstract after you've finished the paper, because it has to match what is in the paper. So in that abstract, introduce the work in no more than 3 sentences. And depending on how many words you're allowed, you may just want to restrict that to 1 sentence even. You don't need technical details in the abstract, but you do need to describe briefly what it is what the sample was that you were studying. And there I've got an example. So I haven't said how those samples were genotyped, but I've mentioned how many patients there are, which is often very valuable in an abstract, and how they were assessed. Then you summarize the most important results. Again, really no more than 2 sentences should be needed. And then summarize the discussion and conclusions in between 1 and 3 sentences. So that should be your abstract format. There's some flexibility depending on whether it's 500 words, 400 or 200. Okay, how are we doing for time? So I've been going for an hour so far. We'll spend another half hour talking about publishing research, but I just wondered whether anybody has any questions they'd like to ask at this stage for what I've been covering in terms of preparing a research project, preparing a paper and writing a paper. Any comments, any points? And if anybody else wants to go for a toilet break like that young man, they can do. Yeah, maybe we should have is that a good idea? Yeah, have a 3-minute break or something. Yeah. Okay, everybody, we're going to get started again. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the process of publishing, submitting your paper, responding to the reviewers. This should be fairly quick, so let's get going. Remember that it's the editor who decides if a paper is suitable for publication. Now, sometimes that editor, and increasingly, I think, the editor is delegating the decision to the reviewers, but the editor can always override the reviewer's decision. So the important thing is to convince the editor that the paper is suitable for publication. So good preparation of the manuscript is very important. Be brief. It's really, actually, it's enough to say, we wish to submit our paper entitled blah, 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 for publication in your journal. If you have to explain your paper to the editor, then perhaps you haven't written the abstract properly, because the editor will read the abstract in order to understand the content of the paper. So if you have to explain what the content of the paper is, then the abstract can't be good enough. So if you write a good abstract, you don't need to explain anything further. But sometimes, however, you can emphasize important aspects that may not be in the abstract. So if, for example, your finding has important implications for diagnostic testing or for treatment, then you can say so. Tell the editor that in your cover letter. Don't be afraid to disagree. Politely, of course. If the editor says the paper isn't suitable for publication, as I said, that Lancet paper that I submitted first, that got rejected by the editor, but immediately. But after discussion with friends, I decided that I should write back to the editor, point out that they had already published papers that are of a lower standard, smaller samples, less important aspects than my research. So, and then convince the editor that it should be accepted. Remember, the editor is interested in increasing the impact factor of the journal, and we heard that yesterday. But that is probably an important thing to do. And one way is to point out that, you know, your results may attract other citations, perhaps because they're controversial. Perhaps, you know, people might argue with your results or disagree with them. But disagreeing may be a good thing because you get cited. So that may increase interest and citations, and you could say that. Make comparisons. If a related paper has been published by the journal, explain why your paper is as good or better than that paper. So here we've got an example. While our study addresses the same problem as Smith et al., we assess more comprehensive measures of outcome in a bigger sample. So you're saying Smith's done similar work, but ours is a lot better. Remember that you are responding to the reviewer's comments, but you are writing to the editor. So that means you can point out to the editor if the reviewer is wrong. You can point out to the editor if the reviewer has missed something. You can point out to the editor if he's being inflexible about something that's really annoying him, but is unimportant. Make your responses clear and brief. I know that Asian students like to be very polite, and I've seen people writing, we thank the reviewer so much for his valuable comments. You don't have to say that. I'm a reviewer sometimes, and I want to have a clear answer to questions or points that I make. I don't want people to tell me how great I am. I know that already. You just have to say, you know, here we have an example. The authors have not included the units in table 3. That was very silly. You should have included units, but we have now corrected this error. You don't have to say, thank you so much for pointing out the problem with this paper. We appreciate your help and advice. You don't say that. Just say, we've corrected the paper, the error. Here, they have failed to cite the reports that this polymorphism is associated with depression. So now we know who one of the reviewers is likely to be. It's probably Smith. As Smith wants his paper to be cited. But you answer this. The reviewer has missed our mention on page 12 that several reports have failed to replicate Smith's work. So Smith isn't going to be very happy with that, but it's the editor that makes the decision. Don't include new information that you don't use in the text of the paper. So, you know, the reviewer might ask a question. You might answer that question. But the only reason a reviewer asks a question is because he wants a change in the manuscript. So here, this is actually taken from a paper that we submitted. How did the authors choose the dose of the drug used to treat the animals? We didn't put that in. We wanted to answer that. My student said, we have chosen the dose of drug based on previous studies and cited two studies. But you don't want to say that. You don't want to give them the information in your response. You want that information in the text of the paper. So what you should say is, we've chosen the dose of drug based on previous studies now cited in the manuscript. We have now added an explanation of this in the text. So there, you're telling the reviewer you've improved the text of the paper. If you believe a reviewer is biased or is incorrect, say so. So here I've said, the reviewer appears to reject our findings on the basis of the work of Smith et al. This work has not been replicated. So you are able to criticize that work to the editor, because Smith is probably the reviewer and he wants his papers cited. And I usually finish with this statement. We hope you agree. We've addressed all the reviewer's concerns and believe the manuscript is now suitable for publication. So there you're saying, we've done everything you ask, so let's get it published. And that's it. So thank you for listening. I think you should have questions. I would hope you do. So do ask me questions if you have any, and if you have any problems with your papers, tell me.
Thank you for your informative presentation. I have a question, because how should I choose the paper between the high impact factor paper that have the wide the reader, and with the specific paper that have lower impact factor, but that's specific in the group of the researcher?
I think you have to think of who is going to benefit from this paper. I think for it to be have a general audience, then it's got to be of interest to people outside your area of interest. So if you're working on diabetes, say, then if you have a finding that's important and might tell us something about how to prevent diabetes, then maybe that is something for a general audience. But if it's a specific aspect of the treatment of diabetes, maybe that is for a diabetes journal. So you really have to think, you know, if this was not my field of interest, would I still think it a good paper, or would I not be interested? So I think that's the way to do it. And of course, high impact means high quality, usually. So it has to be a high quality paper to go into a general journal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for nice talk and easy to understand. I have one question. What are the important details for the cover letter?
What are the important details for the cover letter? I think I tried to answer that. A cover letter should be simple and clear. So I think the minimum is to say we wish we submit this paper for consideration for publication in your journal. Sometimes you don't need to say more than that. If there are aspects of the paper you think are important which are not in the abstract, for example, if your work might have impact on how doctors treat patients, then perhaps you should say that. You can say, this study has implications in the future treatment of people with diabetes or something like that. So you can explain the relevance, but most aspects of the paper should be in the abstract. It's only those sort of broader, more general points that may need emphasizing in the cover letter. But there's no problem with just having a very short and clear letter saying we want to be published in your journal.
Good morning, Professor. My latest problem, my lab is facing resembles self-plagiarism. In our group, we collaborate on generating natural products and often utilize the same extract or bioactive compounds to generate natural products. It's just development step by step. However, it's important to note that work is more of an extension rather than duplication. The replications of the repetitions of some extract, fraction, or method can inadvertently lead to self-plagiarism. Do you have any idea to solve this problem?
I think that's a very difficult thing to answer. I haven't experienced it myself. I think editors will be flexible about that. I think the problem comes from these very big journals like the Frontiers journals, MDPI journals, where there are the work is put through a plagiarism software. It picks up what it appears, what it suggests is self-plagiarism, and then somebody who isn't the editor writes to you and says, you should correct all this. I I would be tempted to argue and say there is a limited number of ways we can describe a process that we have repeated. So I have not really understood why self-plagiarism has been such a major problem, or is becoming a major problem especially when it is in methods. I think outside the methods section, you need to be very careful. But within the methods section, it's almost impossible to avoid it. If you're doing studies using the same technique in several papers. So I haven't got an answer for you other than to argue and say, how else can we describe this? You know, we've done this before, we're doing the same thing. Why should we say we're doing something differently? Because we're not. So I would argue with it and draw attention to the journal editor, because often it's not the editor who makes those decisions. It's somebody lower down who is just processing manuscripts and who doesn't really understand the process. Not overcritical review.
Right.
I think, you know, some junior people look for problems and try to elevate the importance of those problems. And I think you do need somebody who will look at it more objectively.
Right.
So big names can be a problem, I think, for that reason.
Some junior researchers use this way to get to know the big name. And it might be advantage in the future in collaboration or things like that.
Well, yes, except your big name reviewer, in theory, you don't know that it's gone to him, because you may be asked to give 5 reviewer names,
right?
And the editor will perhaps choose from that list. Mm-hmm. Now, I try to avoid doing much journal editing. So but where I have been an editor, I have not always trusted the list of reviewers that are sent by yourself. And so in that case, I would sometimes check, why has that person been chosen? And perhaps check whether there are joint papers between him and you. But also, I might look for other reviewers from the reference list of your paper. So, but I think some editors are much more lazy and just work through the 5 or 6 and hope that one of them, 2 of them will give you a review.
Right. Thank you.
Gavin, if you be editor, you would select the suggested reviewer from the same countries, or you should avoid from the same country, even the like the expertise in this area of the manuscript.
No, I would not let that put me off. I think I wouldn't be worried about somebody in the same country. I would be worried about if they were collaborating and hadn't said so. Yeah.
And
Gavin, in terms of your reviewer action, what is your feeling reading the paper from people not using English as a native language, or you avoid?
No,
accept that.
No, I try to be more open about it, because I know that what some people don't recognize is that English there is not one type of English.
Right.
You know, there is Malaysian English, there is Indian English, and they use words in a different way and use grammar in a different way. So I try to be open and flexible about that. The important thing is whether the meaning is clear. If the meaning is not clear,
Right.
then that is disaster.
Okay.
But you know, if there are small errors, maybe I would say there are small errors, but I won't let that affect the decision I make. I try not to anyway.
One last question from me. Once you try to make your decision, which one is I'm gonna read it or not gonna read it, what part of the article that you read first, abstract or?
Yeah, I
Yes.
would read the abstract first.
Right.
If I don't understand it, I would quickly go through the introduction, which I hope would make me understand what the project, what it was all about.
Right.
And then I might look at the conclusions at the end of the discussion.
Right.
And then you know, if I'm happy with that, then I start going through it in more detail.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your informative presentation. Right now, I got the rejected from lung cancer journal. However, the editor transferred me to Helion, which is like multidisciplinary journal. So yeah, my question is, should I stick to specific journal? Like I'm thinking to go to like clinical lung cancer, or should I still consider like Helion or scientific report for submission?
I think that might depend on what the reviewers say. So if you have reviewers' comments and you think they're fairly positive and you want a lung cancer audience or cancer audience, then maybe it would be better to resubmit in perhaps just a slightly less important cancer journal. But if the reviewers are fairly critical about the importance of the paper in terms of cancer research, then maybe take the editor's advice and go for a more general, a multidisciplinary journal.
Yes, thank you very much.
Right. Kevin, can I have another question? So is it important to add that this manuscript has been submitted to elsewhere or other journals, just only in this journal? So is it important to get this phrase or this sentence in the cover letter?
I think that depends on the journal. So some journals will say, it is understood that if you are submitting a paper to this journal, then you have not submitted it at the same time elsewhere. I think, and usually there might be a tick box for that, in which case you don't need to say it in the cover letter because you've already confirmed it. I think,
In the past.
yeah.
Right. Okay.